The burning wreckage of Captain Ethan Reeves' scout ship lay scattered across the twisted, luminous landscape of Zalara. Jagged crystalline trees jutted from the ground like spears, glowing faintly with inner light. His breathing was ragged as he stumbled through the alien terrain, his survival gear reduced to shreds in the crash. His pulse hammered in his chest, both from exhaustion and the primal fear of the unknown. He was utterly alone. No distresbiakon. No backup. Just him and a planet deemed uninhabitable by every star chart he'd ever studied. Yet the strange signs of deliberate construction he had spotted earlier suggested otherwise. A low growl echoed through the air, freezing Ethan midstep. His eyes scanned the twisted forest. Something large was moving fast. He barely had time to react before a massive, predatory beast lunged from the underbrush, a blur of chitinous limbs and serrated claws. He dived out of the way, rolling down a jagged embankment and landing hard in the soft, phosphorescent moss below. His lungs burned, and his right leg throbbed where he'd hit the ground. As he staggered to his feet, ready to fight or flee, a sharp, commanding voice split the air, resonating with an almost musical cadence. Ethan turned just in time to see a group of tall, armor-clad alien warriors emerge from the shadows. They moved with lethal grace, their crystalline weaponry shimmering with cold, blue light. At their center stood a striking figure, taller than the rest, regal and imposing. Her armor gleamed with iridescent symbols of rank and power. Her skin shimmered faintly like living marble, marked with intricate designs that pulsed in time with her steady breath. Her deep violet eyes locked onto Ethan, sharp and assessing, burning with intensity. She radiated authority. Ethan barely had time to raise his hands in what he hoped was a universal gesture of surrender before she closed the distance with effortless speed. Before he could speak, she reached out and touched his temple with two gloved fingers. A sudden, searing heat lanced through his mind, leaving him gasping. The world blurred for a moment as unfamiliar emotions and half-formed thoughts invaded his consciousness. He staggered back, panting. What the hell was that? The alien woman tilted her head, studying him as though evaluating a strange, unpredictable creature. Her lips curved into a faint, knowing smirk, equal parts intrigue and superiority. Ethan's heart pounded. There was something intensely disarming about that look, like a hunter admiring particularly interesting prey. She spoke again, her words incomprehensible but lyrical, like distant thunder wrapped in silk. He couldn't understand the language, but her tone conveyed meaning. Power, control, curiosity. Two of her guards advanced, binding his wrists with shimmering restraints made of psionic light. He resisted, but their strength was overwhelming. The alien woman stepped closer, tracing the glowing restraints thoughtfully with her fingertips, her gaze never leaving his face. Her touch lingered just a moment longer than necessary, a deliberate act of dominance. The warmth of her fingers burned through the cool light, sending a strange pulse of awareness through him. Ethan met her gaze with defiance. If you're planning to kill me, he bit out, get it over with. Her eyes narrowed, dark amusement flickering across her expression. She whispered something in her native tongue, a command that made her guard step back. Then, with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator, she reached up and touched his face again, her palm resting against his cheek. Her fingers brushed his skin lightly, almost curiously. The contact was electric, charged with something far more complex than simple aggression. Ethan held his breath, unable to move, trapped by the intensity of her gaze and the burning heat of her touch. He could feel her probing presence pressing gently against his mind, searching, exploring, not with cruelty, but with undeniable purpose. It was invasive, yet strangely intimate, leaving him breathless and disoriented. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were his ragged breathing and the faint hum of the glowing forest around them. Finally, she drew back, her expression unreadable but tinged with satisfaction, as though she had confirmed something important. Without another word, she turned sharply and gestured for her guards to follow. leaving Ethan bound and forced to march behind them toward an unknown fate. As he was led deeper into the alien wilderness, Ethan couldn't shake the memory of her touch, the heat of her skin, the fierce intelligence in her eyes. She hadn't looked at him like prey or even a prisoner. She'd looked at him like a puzzle she was determined to solve. Ethan's boots scraped against the polished stone floors as he was escorted through a towering, alien fortress of shimmering crystalline architecture. Pulsing veins of light ran through the walls, casting shifting hues of blue and violet across the vast, echoing corridors. The air was cool but thrummed with strange energy, a hum he could feel vibrating through his skin. Whatever technology powered this place was far beyond anything he had ever seen. His wrists were still bound by the glowing psionic restraints, though his captors had loosened them slightly. The guards surrounding him remained stoic and silent, their expressions unreadable beneath their sleek armor. But Ethan's mind kept circling back to her, the alien woman who had claimed him with such calm, predatory confidence. She hadn't spoken to him again after their encounter in the forest, but he could still feel the lingering heat of her touch, the weight of her gaze burning through his memory. He hated how deeply it unsettled him, not just because of the power she wielded, but because of the strange, magnetic pull she seemed to exert on him. It was more than intimidation. It was something far more primal. The guards led him into a vast, circular chamber bathed in soft, luminescent light. Intricate symbols glowed faintly across the walls, shifting like living constellations. At its center was a raised platform of polished stone, surrounded by what looked like an elaborate array of alien symbols etched into the floor. Before he could take in more, the guards shoved him forward, forcing him to kneel on the cold platform. He clenched his jaw, refusing to show weakness even as they tightened the restraints around his wrists and ankles. Then she entered. The alien woman moved with effortless grace, her commanding presence filling the chamber like an approaching storm. Gone was the combat armor from before. Now she wore a flowing, midnight blue mantle edged with shimmering silver glyphs. Her long, dark hair cascaded over her shoulders like liquid obsidian, framing her striking features. Her expression was cool, controlled, but her eyes still burned with that fierce intensity, locked solely on him. Ethan's breath hitched despite himself. She was every bit as intimidating as he remembered, but now there was something even more dangerous about her. Something calculated, deliberate. She descended the steps of the chamber with the slow, measured confidence of someone who knew she held absolute power. With a subtle gesture, she dismissed the guards. The heavy doors sealed behind them, leaving Ethan alone with her in the vast, silent chamber. He struggled against his bindings. "You could have just killed me back in the forest," he said sharply. "What is this? Some kind of interrogation?" She didn't answer. Instead, she circled him slowly, studying him with piercing intensity, as though evaluating every inch of his being. Her gaze lingered just long enough to make his skin prickle, leaving him hyper-aware of his vulnerability. Finally, she spoke, not in her alien tongue this time, but in a voice that resonated directly in his mind. Her words echoed with cool authority, threaded with curiosity and something far more intimate. "You are not what I expected." Ethan's eyes widened. You can understand me?" She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. Language is irrelevant where minds can touch. Her voice in his mind was deep, velvety, and unsettlingly close, like a whispered secret brushing against his thoughts. Before he could respond, she stepped closer, her fingertips hovering just above his temple. A faint glow of psionic energy flickered between them. He jerked back instinctively, but there was nowhere to go. "Stay out of my head," he growled. Her lips curved into a faint, knowing smile, not unkind, but far from reassuring. "You fear what you do not understand." Without warning, her hand settled gently against his face, her palm warm against his cheek. The soft, electric hum of her touch sent a jolt through him, making it impossible to pull away. He could feel her presence pressing against his mind again. Not invasive this time, but insistent, curious. "Show me," her voice commanded gently, What you are. The mental connection deepened, and for a brief, breathless moment, Ethan felt as though he were falling. His thoughts stripped bare, memories flickering past like scattered leaves in the wind. He saw flashes of Earth, of his home, of his past battles and bitter regrets. She saw it all with startling clarity, yet there was no cruelty in her touch, only intense curiosity, and then tempered by something far more complex. The walls between their minds wavered just enough for him to glimpse something deeply personal, memories locked behind cold, calculated control. A battlefield drenched in fire, a throne of empty power, an endless, lonely struggle for dominance and survival. Her longing was buried deep, hidden beneath her fierce strength, but it was there, raw and unyielding. Ethan gasped as the connection broke, leaving him trembling. His breath came in ragged gulps, his pulse thundering in his ears. Whatever just happened had gone far deeper than he ever imagined. The alien woman withdrew her hand, her expression carefully neutral, but her breathing was slightly unsteady, her eyes darker than before. For the first time, she seemed just as shaken by the experience as he was. Why are you doing this? Ethan rasped, still reeling from the intensity of the shared contact. She regarded him in silence, her gaze unreadable but charged with something that defied words. Slowly, deliberately, she leaned in, her voice brushing softly against his mind like the edge of a whispered promise. Because you are unique. Before he could respond, she stepped back and gestured toward the door. The guards re-entered, pulling Ethan to his feet as if nothing had happened. But as he was led away, still reeling from the depth of their shared connection, Ethan realized one thing with chilling certainty. Whatever she was planning, it was far from over. Ethan was led through a labyrinth of crystalline halls that pulsed with an eerie, living light. His mind still reeled from the strange, intimate encounter with the alien woman. Her touch, her voice in his head, the electric pull between them. He couldn't forget the intensity of her gaze or the way her emotions had bled into his mind, as if she'd let him glimpse something she kept hidden even from herself. The guards brought him to a dimly lit chamber carved from smooth, shimmering stone. The air hummed softly, charged with the same strange energy that permeated the entire fortress. Without a word, they pushed him inside and activated a shimmering barrier of blue light, sealing him in. He staggered forward, rubbing his raw wrists where the restraints had chafed. His thoughts spiraled as he paced the confined space. She wasn't just curious about him. She wanted something from him, though he couldn't tell if it was information, control, or something far more dangerous. Before he could sort through his swirling thoughts, the air shimmered near the entrance as the barrier deactivated. His pulse spiked as she entered, her flowing mantle trailing behind her like liquid starlight. She dismissed the guards with a simple flick of her hand, leaving them alone once again. Ethan clenched his fists, struggling to maintain control. Back for round two? He challenged, masking his unease with bravado. Or do you enjoy playing with your prisoners? She tilted her head, studying him with cool amusement. You are resilient, she said, her voice resonating softly. Not in his mind this time, but aloud, her accent smooth but alien. It was the first time she'd spoken his language, though her tone held the same commanding authority. He held her gaze. You've got a funny way of showing hospitality. Her lips curved faintly, whether in amusement or something deeper, he couldn't tell. You intrigue me. She stepped closer, her presence dominating the small space. You are unlike any being I have encountered. Your mind, your resistance, fascinates me. Ethan forced himself to remain still, though his breath quickened as she moved within arm's reach. Her scent was faint but intoxicating, something sharp and exotic, like charged air before a storm. What do you want from me? He demanded, his voice low but steady. Her expression softened, just a fraction. Understanding. Before he could react, she reached out again. But this time, her touch was different. Her fingertips brushed his jaw with almost tender curiosity, tracing the edge of his stubbled chin. The contact sent a spark through him, electric and undeniable. He couldn't suppress a sharp intake of breath. "You hide your emotions," she murmured, her voice softer now, almost thoughtful. "But your mind speaks louder than words." His pulse pounded as her fingers drifted down to rest lightly against his chest, where his heart beat like a drum beneath her touch. He felt trapped, but not by the restraints or the room. It was her presence, her intensity, that held him captive. Ethan gritted his teeth. "If you think you can manipulate me," her gaze locked onto his, sharp and unyielding, "you misunderstand." Her voice dropped lower, resonating like a distant storm. "I do not need to manipulate what is already connected." Before he could react, she closed the distance between them entirely. Her free hand rose to his temple, her touch cool but searing with energy. His breath hitched as her presence brushed against his mind once more. Not forcefully this time, but gently, like a whispered invitation. He shuddered as he felt her emotions flicker through the bond. Curiosity, hunger, longing, but also something deeper, more fragile. He felt her barriers strain, as though she was choosing to let him see a piece of herself. The intimacy of the connection left him breathless, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he allowed himself to meet her halfway, letting down his own guard just enough to push back. Not with anger or resistance, but with raw, unfiltered emotion. The impact hit her like a physical force. Her eyes widened, darkening with intensity as she stumbled back, breathing sharply as if burned. Whatever she'd expected from him, it clearly wasn't this. For a long, suspended moment, neither of them spoke. Their shared breath hung heavy in the charged air, thick with tension and something far more potent. Finally, she straightened, regaining her composure, though her gaze remained molten, locked onto his with undeniable fire. "You surprise me, human," she admitted, her voice lower now, roughened with emotion she couldn't suppress. Ethan stepped forward, closing the space between them with sudden, reckless boldness. His gaze never wavered as he spoke, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "Maybe you're not the only one who's curious." For the first time, her mask of control cracked, just slightly, but enough for him to see something raw and vulnerable beneath the fierce, dominant exterior she projected. Her lips parted as though to respond, but no words came. Then, just as subtly as she had appeared, she drew back, her expression shuddering once more. With a swift, graceful turn, she left the room without another word, the shimmering barrier reactivating behind her. Ethan stood frozen, his heart pounding like a war drum. Whatever game she was playing, whatever strange bond had sparked between them, it was far from over, and deep down he wasn't sure whether he wanted it to end, or to see how far it would go. Ethan's breathing finally steadied after what felt like hours in the shimmering confinement of his strange cell. His mind replayed every charged moment with the alien woman. The fierce intensity of her gaze, the searing touch of her hand, the magnetic pull he couldn't ignore. There was something about her that unsettled him, something powerful and deeply personal, something he couldn't escape. The barrier sealing his cell suddenly dimmed, flickering before vanishing entirely. Ethan tensed, half expecting her to return, but instead, two armored guards appeared, their faces expressionless behind their crystalline helmets. They gestured for him to follow, leaving no room for argument. He considered resisting but knew it would be pointless. If she wanted him dead, it would have happened long ago. Whatever game this was, he was still a piece on the board. The guards led him through twisting halls of translucent stone, the alien light casting shifting patterns across his skin. They finally stopped at a massive set of engraved doors pulsing with an otherworldly energy. With a silent command, the guards activated the door, and it slid open with a resonant hum. Ethan was pushed inside, the heavy doors sealing behind him with a definitive thud. His senses sharpened immediately as he surveyed the vast, open chamber beyond. The room was unlike anything he had seen. A high, domed space carved from luminous crystal, its walls etched with glowing symbols that pulsed in slow, rhythmic waves. In the center of the room stood an elaborate platform of swirling stone and light, surrounded by intricate patterns etched into the floor like ritualistic designs. And there she was, standing tall and composed at the center of the platform, regal and untouchable in her flowing, midnight blue mantle adorned with shimmering glyphs. Her dark hair gleamed under the soft, ambient glow, and her violet eyes locked onto his the moment he entered. He hated the way his breath caught at the sight of her, as though his body remembered her touch before his mind could protest. "Approach," she commanded, her voice low but resonant with undeniable authority. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward, determined not to show weakness. Whatever this was, the glowing platform, every nerve on edge. "What now?" he demanded. More mind games. Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her gaze. Something intense and unreadable. "This is no game." Before he could respond, she raised one hand, and the symbols on the floor flared to life in brilliant patterns, forming an intricate web of energy that surrounded them both. The air grew charged, crackling with unseen power. Ethan tensed, his fists clenched. "What the hell are you doing?" Her eyes burned with fierce purpose. "The bond between us has been initiated. Unintended, but irreversible." Her voice softened just slightly. "You saved my life when we first met, even though you were weak, wounded, vulnerable. By our laws, such a debt cannot go unpaid." Ethan frowned. "What kind of debt?" "A life debt," she answered, stepping down from the platform, her gaze never leaving his. "By the laws of my people, I am bound to protect you. If you accept." He stared at her, struggling to comprehend. "And if I don't?" Her expression hardened. "Then you will be cast out. Alone, defenseless." She paused, her voice lowering. "And I will forget you." The last words hit harder than he expected, cutting through his guarded defenses. For all her power and control, there was something painfully genuine in her voice. A flicker of vulnerability she couldn't quite suppress. Ethan took a slow breath. "What does accepting mean?" Her gaze softened, not with weakness, but with quiet intensity. "It means bonding." She reached toward him, her fingertips just grazing his wrist, sending a familiar spark through his skin. "Apermanent." Mind, body, soul. His pulse pounded. There was no mistaking the gravity of her words, or the charged, magnetic pull between them. He could feel her presence brushing against his mind again, insistent but no longer forceful. An invitation, not a command. "And if I say yes, what happens to us?" His voice was barely above a whisper. She stepped even closer, her fingers sliding down his wrist until her hand rested lightly against his. "We become one." The last word carried an almost reverent intensity. Ethan stared into her impossibly deep violet eyes, drawn in despite every instinct telling him to run. He could feel the truth in her words, the sheer weight of what she was offering. Not just survival, but something far more dangerous. Connection, intimacy, trust. His breath hitched as he slowly laced his fingers through hers, feeling her sharp intake of breath at the unexpected gesture. For a moment, they simply stood there, locked in silent understanding, their hands entwined in quiet acceptance. Then, with deliberate grace, she lifted her free hand and gently traced his jaw, her touch feather-light but searing with emotion. He shivered beneath her fingertips, unable to resist leaning into the warmth of her palm. Without breaking eye contact, she rose onto her toes and pressed her lips softly against his. A tentative, testing kiss that burned through every barrier he'd built. It was a collision of fire and vulnerability, fierce yet achingly tender. Ethan's mind reeled, but instinct took over. He cupped her face in return, deepening the kiss as he pulled her closer, letting himself feel for the first time since he'd crashed on this strange, deadly world. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and trembling, she rested her forehead gently against his, her voice a whisper in his mind once more. "You are mine, as I am yours." He closed his eyes, still holding her close, knowing with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. Ethan stood at the edge of the grand hall, his eyes scanning the sea of alien nobility gathered under the arched ceiling of radiant crystalline light. The alien court was vast and imposing, with towering stone pillars etched in shimmering runes that pulsed softly like living veins. 1,000 glowing eyes from dozens of alien delegates fixed on him with varying shades of disdain, curiosity, and outright contempt. He adjusted the alien-made cloak draped over his shoulders, a deep blue mantle marked with the insignia of House Vyrian. It was meant to signify his newly forged bond with Lady Selira, though judging by the hostile stares from the court, it was as much a target as a symbol of protection. Selira stood beside him, regal and composed, her expression unreadable. She wore ceremonial armor inlaid with shimmering silver glyphs, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders in sleek waves. Her presence radiated power and authority, making her the focal point of the room, though every gaze inevitably drifted to him, the outsider, the human. Ethan clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to fidget under the weight of so much scrutiny. He'd been in hostile situations before, but this was something else entirely. These beings weren't just watching him, they were judging him, as though his very existence was an offense. A sharp chime echoed through the hall, silencing the low murmur of conversation. A tall, silver-armored alien with sharp features and a flowing mantle of deep crimson stepped forward, his expression twisted with smug superiority. Ethan recognized him from Selira's earlier descriptions. Lord Kalen, a powerful noble and one of her most dangerous rivals. Lady Selira Vyrian, Kalen intoned, his voice smooth but venom-laced. You return from exile. With this? He gestured toward Ethan with a sneer, his gaze filled with open contempt. Have the mighty fallen so far that you claim a pet? The court erupted in murmurs of cruel amusement and whispered mockery. Ethan's fists clenched, his temper flaring, but Selira lifted a hand. A subtle but commanding gesture that instantly silenced the crowd. He is no pet, she said coldly, her voice slicing through the room like tempered steel. He is my bonded partner under the right of life debt, by the ancient laws of Zalara. His life is bound to mine, as is my protection of him. Her violet eyes blazed as she stepped forward. Challenge this, if you dare. Her challenge hung in the air, crackling with unspoken power. Even Kalen hesitated, his smirk faltering for the briefest moment before he recovered. Protection, you say? Kalen drawled, circling slowly as his gaze raked over Ethan like a predator studying weak prey. But can he earn it? His eyes glittered with malice. Can he even survive in a world such as ours? Ethan bristled, stepping forward before he could think better of it. Why don't you find out? The court gasped collectively at his audacity, and for a moment, even Kalen seemed caught off guard. Ethan felt Selira's sharp intake of breath beside him. Whether from anger or something else, he couldn't tell. Kalen's lips twisted into a predatory smile. Bold words. For a fragile thing. With a sweeping motion, Kalen gestured toward the open floor of the grand hall. The glowing runes etched into the stone blazed to life, forming an intricate combat ring. The crowd surged back, eager for a spectacle. Selira's hand brushed Ethan's wrist, her grip firm but not restraining. Ethan, don't. I can't stand here while they treat me like this. His voice was low but steady, his gaze never leaving Kalen's. I'm not just some helpless prize. She studied him with piercing intensity, her fingers lingering for a heartbeat longer than necessary before she withdrew. Very well, but be ready. Ethan stepped into the ring, feeling the alien energy of the runes thrumming beneath his feet. Kalen discarded his ceremonial cloak, revealing a set of gleaming combat armor that pulsed with built-in psionic enhancements. 2 slender energy blades flared to life in his hands, crackling with lethal energy. Ethan barely had time to brace before Kalen struck. The alien noble moved with terrifying speed, his twin blades slicing through the air like molten lightning. Ethan narrowly dodged the first swing, his reflexes honed by years of combat training kicking in despite the surreal nature of the fight. But Kalen was relentless. He pressed forward, driving Ethan back with a flurry of precise, deadly strikes. Ethan managed to grab a fallen staff-like weapon from the side of the ring. Likely ceremonial, but sturdy enough to block the next incoming strike with a resounding clang. The force of the impact sent shockwaves up Ethan's arms, but he held firm, countering with a desperate swing that forced Kalen back a step. The court watched in stunned silence, clearly expecting the fight to be over already. Ethan gritted his teeth, adrenaline surging as he sidestepped another slash and swept Kalen's legs out from under him with a precise strike. The noble crashed to the ground, his energy blades skittering out of reach. Before Kalen could recover, Ethan planted the end of the staff firmly against the alien's throat, his chest heaving from exertion. The room went deathly silent. Kalen's eyes blazed with humiliation and barely contained rage, but he made no move to resist. Defeated, Ethan slowly withdrew the staff, stepping back as the glowing combat ring dimmed. The court erupted into stunned murmurs, disbelief written across every alien face, whose gaze burned with something fierce and unreadable. Pride, relief, something deeper. For the first time since he'd arrived in this strange, deadly world, he felt seen. "Is that earned enough for you?" he rasped, his voice hoarse but steady. Scifi strode forward, her expression hard but her eyes blazing with intensity. She stopped just inches from him, her voice low but resonant. "You fought, not for yourself, but for us." Her hand rose, resting gently against his chest where his heart still thundered beneath her touch. "That is all I needed to see." Ethan's breath hitched, caught between exhaustion and something far more powerful as her fingers brushed against his skin, warm, grounding, real. Whatever fragile bond had sparked between them before had just become something unbreakable, and every soul in the room knew it. Ethan stood in the dim light of Scifi's private chambers, still breathing hard from the intense duel that had secured his place by her side, at least for now. The alien court's shocked murmurs still echoed in his mind, though they felt distant and unimportant compared to the fierce, unreadable look she'd given him just before leading him away from the grand hall. The room was expansive yet intimate, its walls formed from crystalline stone that shimmered faintly in soft hues of blue and violet. Strange, flowing symbols pulsed gently across the surfaces like living veins, creating an otherworldly serenity. The air hummed with faint psionic energy, charged and electric, much like the tension still crackling between them. Scifi stood near the central hearth-like structure, her back to him, her shoulders rigid beneath her dark cloak embroidered with silver glyphs. Her hands rested on the smooth surface of the curved stone table, fingers flexing as though struggling to contain something too vast to express. Ethan exhaled slowly, his muscles still tight from the fight and the overwhelming events that followed. He took a cautious step closer, his boots barely making a sound against the polished floor. "You didn't have to fight for me." Her voice was low and steady, though threaded with something raw, something she couldn't quite suppress. He hesitated, searching for the right words. "They needed to see that I wasn't weak." She turned slowly, her violet eyes burning with intensity. "You think their opinions matter?" There was sharpness in her tone, though not directed at him. "The court thrives on fear and control. You owe them nothing." Ethan met her gaze, refusing to back down. "I wasn't fighting for them. I was fighting for you." Her breath hitched, just slightly, but she held his gaze, her expression unreadable. Slowly, she stepped forward, the soft glow of the room's ambient light catching in her dark hair and shimmering armor. "You should fear me," she whispered, her voice dark and resonant. "You should have run the moment you realized what I am." Ethan took another step forward, closing the distance between them. "I'm still here." For a moment, her expression fractured, just a flicker of vulnerability breaking through the fierce control she always wore like armor. She reached for him before she could stop herself, her fingers brushing lightly against his chest where his heart still pounded from the fight. "I cannot be what you expect," she murmured, her voice trembling just enough for him to notice. "I was forged for war, for dominance. I cannot change that." He covered her hand with his, holding it firmly against his chest. "I'm not asking you to change. Her breath faltered as his fingers entwined with hers, grounding her, steadying her. Slowly, she let her other hand rise, tracing the edge of his jaw with a touch that was surprisingly gentle, almost reverent. "You defy everything I know," she whispered, her tone low and unsteady. "You feel, even when you should not." He leaned into her touch, his breath warm against her palm. "Maybe you can feel too." Her eyes darkened, filled with something fierce and unspoken, something she had clearly fought to suppress for far too long. With a sharp breath, she closed the last of the distance between them, capturing his lips with hers in a sudden, searing kiss. The world seemed to fracture and realign in that instant. Nothing but the burning heat of their connection, the raw intensity that surged between them like a living flame. Her hands tightened against his chest as he wrapped his arms around her, pulling her closer until there was no space left between them. The kiss deepened, fierce and unyielding, but tempered with a tenderness neither of them had expected. Ethan felt her barriers faltering, her control slipping, not out of weakness, but out of trust. When they finally broke apart, gasping for breath, her forehead rested lightly against his, her fingers still curled against his collar as though afraid to let go. "I cannot be weak," she whispered, her voice ragged and trembling. "If I yield, I lose everything." He cupped her face gently, forcing her to meet his gaze. "You don't have to be weak to trust someone." Her lips trembled, and for a heartbeat, she was simply there, stripped of rank, of power, of expectation. Just Salira, fierce and fragile all at once. "I have never trusted anyone," she admitted, her voice breaking ever so slightly. "Not like this." Ethan smiled faintly, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "Then let me be the first." She closed her eyes, breathing him in, letting herself rest in the safety of his touch, however fleeting it might be. For once, she allowed herself to feel, and it was overwhelming, terrifying, but also freeing. The crystalline lights pulsed softly around them, resonating in time with the steady rhythm of their shared breaths, their bond growing deeper with each passing moment. For the first time in her life, Salira allowed herself to trust, not just with her mind, but with her heart. The stillness of the fortress was shattered by the sharp wail of distant war horns echoing through the crystalline halls. Ethan snapped awake, adrenaline surging as the sound pierced the tranquil calm that had settled after the night he and Salira had shared. He pushed off the edge of the low, curved platform where he had fallen asleep, the faint pulse of the fortress's living walls casting shimmering light across the chamber. His mind reeled, still adjusting to the reality of his bond with Salira, a connection deeper and more intense than anything he had ever experienced. But there was no time to dwell on it now. The door to the chamber burst open, and one of Salira's armored guards stormed in, his breathing ragged and his crystalline armor scorched with battle damage. His alien features were sharp and grim as he snapped to attention. "Lady Vyrian," he rasped, "the fortress is under attack." Salira was already on her feet, fastening her armored mantle with practiced efficiency. Her violet eyes burned with fierce determination, her expression a mask of command and control once more. Ethan could almost believe she was unaffected by the night they'd shared, but he felt the faint pulse of their bond, still thrumming with shared intensity beneath her composed exterior. "Who dares?" she demanded, her voice cold and commanding. "Lord Kalen," the guard answered, bitterness sharp in his tone. "He's declared open rebellion. He's already breached the outer gates with allied war clans." Ethan felt a rush of anger and grim understanding. Kalen hadn't taken his defeat in the combat arena lightly. This attack was personal. Ethan could practically see the alien lord's twisted smirk in his mind, imagining this final, brutal strike meant to crush Salira and erase any trace of her defiant claim on power and on him. "I should have killed that bastard when I had the chance," Ethan muttered darkly, already reaching for the combat staff he'd taken during the duel days ago. Salira's gaze snapped to him, fierce and protective. "You're not fighting in this with respect," Ethan countered, stepping toward her. You don't get to decide that anymore. Their eyes met, charged with intensity. But there was no room for argument. Not now. Salira's jaw tightened, but she gave a sharp nod, accepting what she couldn't change. You stay with me, she commanded, her voice lowering just slightly. Always. Before Ethan could respond, the fortress trembled beneath their feet, the ground vibrating with distant impacts. The air thrummed with the pulse of activated psionic wards, sending faint arcs of blue energy rippling through the walls like a living heartbeat. Salira turned sharply to her guard. Rally the defense squads. Hold the inner courtyard at all costs. The guard saluted and vanished through the crystalline doors. Salira strode toward the weapons alcove, seizing a curved, shimmering blade forged from living crystal. Its edge pulsed faintly with lethal light, reflecting the storm of emotions she kept buried beneath her calm facade. Ethan followed closely as they raced through the fortress's winding corridors. Everywhere he looked, he saw signs of battle. Scorched walls, shattered crystalline barriers, and fallen defenders. The air was thick with the sharp, electric scent of burned energy and distant inner courtyard. A sprawling open space lined with towering crystalline pillars and flickering shield walls struggling to hold back the relentless assault. Alien soldiers in gleaming armor clashed in brutal combat, psionic blades clashing in bursts of brilliant light. At the center of the chaos stood Kalen himself, clad in dark, jagged armor pulsing with corrupted energy. His expression twisted with cruel satisfaction as his forces pressed the attack. Salira's eyes narrowed with deadly focus. He will pay. Before Ethan could respond, she surged forward like a living storm, her crystalline blade flashing in a deadly arc. Her command presence ignited a renewed charge among her defenders, driving back the enemy with fierce determination. Ethan stayed close, using every bit of combat training he had to defend himself and cover Salira's flank. They fought side by side, their bond pulsing with shared awareness and instinct, a seamless rhythm of movement and purpose. But even with their combined strength, the tide was against them. Kalen's forces pressed closer, relentless and driven by hatred and greed. Ethan could feel Salira's exhaustion through their link, though she refused to slow, fighting with a ferocity born of desperation and defiance. Then Kalen himself advanced, forcing the defenders aside with brutal precision. His twisted, corrupted armor pulsed with dark power as he strode toward Salira, his face twisted with malice. Did you think you could defy me, Virian? He sneered, his voice a poisonous hiss. Did you think bonding with that would save you? His gaze shifted to Ethan with venomous disdain. I will break him and watch you fall. Ethan's grip tightened on his staff, but Salira stepped forward, placing herself between him and Kalen with deadly intent. You will touch nothing, she hissed, her voice sharp as forged steel. Kalen lunged, his corrupted blade flashing with lethal energy. Salira met his strike with equal ferocity, their blades locking in a crackling explosion of power that sent shockwaves rippling through the courtyard. Ethan watched, helpless and furious, as the two warriors clashed in a brutal, deadly dance. Salira's skill matched only by Kalen's overwhelming strength fueled by dark psionic power. But he could feel her slipping, her reserves draining against the relentless onslaught. Desperation surged in Ethan's chest. He couldn't just stand by. Not now, not after everything they'd fought for. With a battle cry ripped from his throat, he charged forward, using every ounce of strength he had left. He drove his staff into Kalen's exposed side with crushing force, sending the alien lord staggering with a snarl of rage. Ethan, Salira shouted, fear and fury mingling in her voice. But there was no time to retreat. Kalen rounded on him with deadly speed, his corrupted blade arcing toward Ethan's unprotected chest. A sudden surge of power erupted between them, a blinding electric pulse of psionic energy that shattered the air like thunder. Ethan felt Salira's presence flood through him like fire and light, their bond blazing with unstoppable intensity. When the light finally faded, Kalen lay motionless, his dark armor shattered, defeated, and Ethan realized they had done this together. The battlefield fell into an eerie stillness, the sounds of combat replaced by the faint hum of crackling energy still lingering in the air. Kalen lay on the ground, his once imposing armor shattered and his body lifeless. Around him, the remnants of his forces faltered, their confidence broken as the leader they had followed with blind zeal was reduced to nothing more than a broken shell. Ethan stood at the center of it all, his breath ragged, his legs unsteady beneath him. The staff he'd wielded hung loosely in his hand, its tip scorched and blackened from the blast of psionic energy that had erupted between him and Selira. His chest still ached with the aftershock of the power they'd unleashed together, a force he didn't entirely understand but could feel deep in his bones. Selira stood just a few feet away, her crystalline blade still clutched in her hand, its sharp glow fading as the immediate danger ebbed. Her violet eyes locked onto Ethan, burning with an intensity that made his breath catch. He could feel the raw, unfiltered pulse of their bond radiating between them, a tether forged in fire and desperation, stronger now than ever. You should not have done that," she said finally, her voice low and trembling with a mix of anger and something softer, something vulnerable. Ethan forced himself to straighten, though every muscle in his body protested. "What, let you fight him alone?" He met her gaze, his tone steady despite the exhaustion weighing him down. "Not a chance." Her jaw tightened, her grip on her blade faltering slightly before she sheathed it with a sharp motion. "You could have been killed." "So could you," he countered, his voice firm but not unkind. "And I wasn't about to let that happen." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of everything they had just endured pressing down on them. Around them, Selira's forces began to regroup, rallying as the last remnants of Kalen's army scattered into retreat. The courtyard, once filled with chaos and death, now echoed with the faint murmur of survivors piecing together what remained. Selira turned her back to him, her shoulders stiff, her head high as she surveyed the battlefield. "I am meant to lead them," she said quietly, though her voice carried the weight of centuries of responsibility. "Not rely on others." Ethan stepped closer, his steps slow but deliberate. "You didn't rely on me. We fought together." She turned sharply, her eyes blazing. "And what if I had lost you?" The words slipped out before she could stop them, her voice raw with emotion she had spent a lifetime burying. "What then?" Ethan froze, caught off guard by the sudden crack in her armor. He could see the turmoil in her eyes, the fear and vulnerability she tried so desperately to hide. Without thinking, he reached out, his hand brushing against hers. A simple, grounding gesture that made her breath hitch. "I'm still here," he said softly, his voice steady. "And I'm not going anywhere." Selira's gaze lingered on him, her violet eyes searching his face as though trying to find some flaw, some weakness that would make him easier to push away. But she found none. Slowly, she let her hand turn beneath his, their fingers entwining in a gesture that felt impossibly fragile for someone who had just faced down death. "You risk too much," she whispered, though the edge in her voice had softened. "So do you," he replied, his tone laced with quiet determination. "And if we're going to keep doing this, we might as well do it together." Her lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile, though it was fleeting, like a shadow passing across the surface of a still lake. "You are infuriating. I've been told that before," he said with a faint grin, though it faded quickly as the reality of their situation settled over him. "But Selira, what now? Kalen's gone. But this isn't over, is it?" Her expression grew somber as she withdrew her hand, though she didn't retreat entirely. "No," she admitted. "There will be others who challenge my rule. Kalen's rebellion was only the beginning. The court will not easily accept you or us." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. "So we fight." Her eyes narrowed, her gaze hardening. "You cannot fight them all. This is not your world, Ethan. The alliances, the politics. It is a battle fought with words as often as with blades." He tilted his head, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Then teach me." Her brows lifted in surprise, though her expression quickly settled into one of quiet contemplation. "You would stay?" Even knowing what this will cost you. He stepped closer, his voice low but resolute. You said it yourself, we're bonded. That's not something I take lightly. For a long moment, she studied him, the weight of her decision reflected in her piercing gaze. Slowly, she nodded, the tension in her posture easing just enough to show she believed him. Very well, she said finally, her tone firm but carrying the faintest edge of warmth. If you are to stand beside me, then you must learn what it means to be a part of this world. Ethan nodded, the faint flicker of a smile returning to his face. I'll figure it out. Salira turned, her mantle flowing behind her as she began walking toward the towering crystalline arch that marked the edge of the courtyard. Ethan followed without hesitation, his steps matching hers as they moved forward together. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. And though the path ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear. They would face it as one. The twin moons of Zalara hung high above the crystalline spires of the fortress, casting shimmering silver light across the now silent courtyard. The battlefield had been cleared, leaving behind only fate's scorch marks and shattered stone, as silent reminders of the battle at the edge of the central balcony. Resting his hands on the cool, polished railing, the wind tugged at his worn cloak, still stained with the dust and ash of the fight. His gaze drifted over the distant horizon where the faint glimmer of enemy ships had long since vanished into the darkened sky. He should have felt relief. Victory was theirs, at least for now. But instead, all he felt was the heavy weight of what was yet to come. The soft sound of footsteps drew his attention. He didn't need to turn to know it was Salira. Her presence was unmistakable, powerful, commanding, and steady, like the pulse of the fortress itself. He could feel her approach through their shared bond, a familiar warmth brushing against his mind. She stopped beside him, her mantle trailing like liquid starlight, the silver embroidery catching the moonlight. She stood in silence for a moment, her gaze distant but focused. They will come again, she said softly, her voice steady but lined with quiet certainty. I know, Ethan replied, his voice low, but we'll be ready. Her eyes met his, searching for any hint of doubt. She found none. You should leave, she said, though her tone lacked conviction. There is nothing tying you to this place but danger. Ethan let out a dry, tired laugh. We both know that's not true. Her gaze softened, her features momentarily unguarded in a way that only he ever saw. You should want more than this. More than endless war and court intrigue. He turned toward her, stepping closer until only a breath separated them. What I want is right here. Her breath hitched, though she held his gaze with unwavering intensity. You are a fool. I've been called worse, he said with a faint smirk. Besides, we're not done fighting yet. She exhaled slowly, as though releasing something she had carried alone for far too long. You will be tested. The court will try to break you. Let them try, he said, his voice firm but warm. I'm not going anywhere. Her hand rose, trembling just slightly, before resting against his chest where she could feel the steady thrum of his heartbeat. You are more than I ever expected. He gently covered her hand with his, grounding her in the same way she grounded him. And you're not getting rid of me that easily. The corner of her mouth lifted in something close to a smile. Not sharp or guarded, but real. She stepped in, resting her forehead against his, letting her eyes close as the weight of the moment settled around them. For a long, still moment, there was only shared breath and quiet understanding. No court, no war, just the two of them bound by something far stronger than either of them could have ever imagined. I have never had an equal, she whispered, her voice rough with emotion she could no longer suppress. You do now, Ethan whispered back, his hand resting lightly against her waist. They stayed like that, suspended in the quiet peace of the moment, knowing it wouldn't last but holding on to it nonetheless. Finally, Salira drew back, though she didn't release his hand. We will rebuild, she said, her voice steady once more, though still touched with warmth. Together, Ethan nodded, his fingers still entwined with hers. Together. The wind stirred again, carrying the distant echoes of the past away into the star-strewn sky. They stood side by side on the balcony, facing the uncertain future with unyielding resolve. Whatever came next, whatever challenges or battles still waited, they would face them as one, bound not by duty or fate, but by something far stronger.